1889, Montana Territory. Jacob Bennett handed over $20 for a horse, the last money he had to his name, but when dawn broke, two native women stood at his campfire with packed belongings and a warning that men with torches were already on their trail. The tribal elder hadn't just sold him transportation. He'd made Jacob the guardian of a secret so dangerous that powerful men were willing to burn entire families alive to keep it buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob Bennett counted the coins for the third time, knowing the number wouldn't change. $20. That's what stood between him and certain death in the mountain passes come winter. The trading post smelled of leather and tobacco smoke, and the October wind rattling the shutters reminded him that snow was maybe 2 weeks out. The horse trader, a man named Wilson with tobacco-stained teeth, wanted 40 for anything worth riding. Jacob had tried bargaining, tried explaining his situation, but Wilson just shrugged, like men freezing to death in the Rockies was as common as morning coffee. That's when the old native man approached him outside the post. He was probably 70, maybe older, with silver hair braided down his back and eyes that seemed to look straight through Jacob's skull into whatever passed for his soul. He wore traditional clothing mixed with settler pieces, a leather vest over woven fabric, boots that had seen 1,000 miles. "You need a horse," the old man said. Not a question. Jacob studied him, trying to read the angle. Nobody offered help without wanting something. "Can't afford what Wilson's asking. I have a mare, strong, fast. She gets you through mountains before snow." The old man's English was careful, each word chosen deliberately. $20. Jacob's hand moved instinctively to his pocket where the coins sat heavy. 20 for a horse that can handle the northern route? What's wrong with it? Nothing wrong. The old man's face remained neutral. "I need $20 today. You need horse today. This is fair trade." Something about the urgency in that statement made Jacob pause. The way the old man kept glancing toward the tree line beyond the settlement. The slight tension in his shoulders, like a man expecting trouble to arrive any minute. Why today, specifically? The old man met his eyes. You ask many questions for man who has no other options. He wasn't wrong. Jacob had spent 6 months working a claim that produced nothing but rocks and disappointment. The $20 came from selling every tool, every possession except his rifle and the clothes on his back. If he didn't get through the mountains before the passes closed, he'd be trapped in territory where he'd made more enemies than friends. "Where's the horse?" "My camp. 1 hour walk." The old man gestured northeast. "You come, you see. Horse is good." Jacob looked back at the trading post, at Wilson visible through the window, counting money that would never be Jacob's. He looked at the sky, at the clouds building on the horizon that promised the first real cold snap. He looked at his options and found exactly one: lead the way. They walked in silence through pine forest that grew denser with each mile. The old man moved with surprising speed for his age, never stumbling, never hesitating at forks in the game trail they followed. Jacob kept his hand near his rifle, not threatening, just ready. "What's your name?" Jacob asked after 30 minutes. "Henry Blackfeather." The old man didn't slow his pace. "I know yours. Jacob Bennett. You worked the Miller claim all summer." "Found nothing." Jacob's jaw tightened. "How do you know that?" "Small territory. People talk." Henry stepped over a fallen log without breaking stride. "They say you are an honest man. Stubborn, maybe, but honestly, honest and broke. Better than dishonest and rich." Henry glanced back. "Rich men make many enemies. Honest men people remember." The camp appeared suddenly. 3 hide shelters arranged around a fire pit, clothes drying on a line, the smell of cooking meat. And there, tied to a sturdy pine, was the most beautiful horse Jacob had seen in years. She was a paint mare, brown and white, with intelligent eyes and powerful legs. Her coat gleamed with health. When Jacob approached, she didn't shy away, just watched him with calm assessment. "She's magnificent," Jacob breathed, running his hand along her neck. The mare nickered softly. "Why would you sell her for $20? Because I need $20 more than I need a horse today. Henry began checking the saddle already fitted to the mare's back. Everything included. Saddle, blanket, supplies and bags. You ride out now, you make 10 miles before dark. Jacob's instinct screamed that something was wrong. Horses like this didn't sell for $20. Men didn't give away supplies and equipment. But he also knew desperation when he saw it, and Henry Blackfeather looked like a man making an impossible choice. Is someone coming for you? Henry's hands stilled on the saddle straps. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then maybe not. But if they do, horse should be gone. She deserved better than what might happen here. What might happen? You want a horse or you want my life story? Henry's voice sharpened. $20. Yes or no? Jacob pulled the coins from his pocket. They felt heavier than $20 worth of metal had any right to feel. Like he was buying more than transportation. Like he was signing a contract with terms he couldn't read. He handed over the money. Henry counted it quickly, then tucked the coins into a leather pouch at his belt. Good, now you go. Ride northeast, follow the ridgeline. 3 days, you reach the pass. Jacob swung into the saddle. The mare shifted beneath him, adjusting to his weight, but didn't protest. What's her name? She has no name. You give her one. Henry stepped back. Go now. Wait. Jacob looked down at the old man. Why me? You could have sold this horse to anyone at that trading post for 3 times what I paid. Henry Blackfeather met his eyes, and Jacob saw something there that made his blood run cold. Not fear exactly. Something worse. The look of a man who'd gambled everything on a stranger and knew the odds were against him, because Wilson would have asked no questions, Henry said quietly. And I needed someone who would. Before Jacob could respond, before he could ask what that meant, Henry slapped the mare's hindquarters. She bolted forward, and Jacob had to grab the saddle horn to keep his seat. By the time he'd gotten her under control and turned back, Henry had disappeared into his shelter. The camp looked suddenly too quiet, too still. Jacob urged the mare forward, following the trail back toward open ground. But his mind churned with questions that had no answers. Why did Henry need exactly $20? Why today? Why give away a horse worth $60 at minimum? And why did Jacob feel like he'd just bought more than a mare and saddle? He'd been riding for maybe 20 minutes when he heard it. Voices behind him, rough and angry, carrying through the forest. Jacob reined in the mare and listened. Told you he'd be here. Check the shelters. Find the old man and we'll find them. Jacob's pulse quickened. Whoever these men were, they were at Henry's camp. And they were looking for someone. Them, the voice had said. Plural. The mare's ears swiveled back, alert to the distant sounds. Jacob stroked her neck, thinking fast. He could keep riding. Whatever trouble was brewing at that camp had nothing to do with him. He'd paid his money, gotten his horse. His only responsibility was surviving the next 3 days. But Henry's last words echoed in his head. I needed someone who would ask questions. Jacob turned the mare around. He moved quietly back through the trees, staying off the trail until he could see the camp through the underbrush. 5 men on horses surrounded Henry's shelters. They wore range clothes but carried themselves like hired muscle. One of them was dragging Henry out of his shelter by his arm. Where are they? The biggest man, broad-shouldered with a scar across his jaw, had his hand on a pistol. We know you were hiding them. I hide no one. Henry's voice was steady despite the rough treatment. I am alone. That's a lie. Scarface nodded to one of the others. Search everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The men dismounted and began tearing through Henry's camp. They ripped open supply bags, kicked over cooking pots, slashed through the hide walls of the shelters. The destruction was methodical and cruel. Jacob watched from concealment, his hand tight on his rifle. 5 against 1 were bad odds. But walking away while an old man got beaten for information felt worse. Then he saw them. 2 women emerged from behind the largest shelter, hands raised in surrender. They must have been hiding there the whole time Jacob was at the camp. Both wore traveling clothes, practical dresses with leather boots, their long dark hair braided for riding. The older one looked maybe 25. The younger, closer to 20. There they are. Scarface smiled, and Jacob's stomach turned at the expression. Wasn't so hard, was it? Henry jerked against the man holding him. You leave them alone. Our agreement was... Your agreement, Scarface laughed. Old man, you don't make agreements. Mr. Calloway makes agreements and you follow them. Now get the girls on horses. We're taking them back. The older woman stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. We won't go back. My father made his choice. Your father made a stupid choice, thinking he could hide you out here like Calloway wouldn't find out. Scarface moved toward her. Now you can come peaceful, or we can make this difficult. Either way, you're coming. Jacob understood then, with sickening clarity, what he'd walked into. Henry hadn't just sold him a horse. He'd tried to send his daughters away before these men arrived. The $20 probably meant nothing. It was just a transaction that looked legitimate, that gave Jacob a reason to take the horse and ride hard away from whatever horror was about to unfold. But Jacob had asked questions, and now he was watching those questions get answered in the worst possible way. One of the men grabbed the younger woman's arm. She cried out, trying to pull free. Her sister lunged forward, and Scarface backhanded her across the face. She hit the ground hard. Henry roared, breaking free from his captor and charging at Scarface. The big man didn't even hesitate. He drew his pistol and brought it down on Henry's skull with a sickening crack. The old man collapsed. "Papa!" The younger woman screamed. Jacob's rifle was in his hands before he'd consciously decided to move. He stepped out of the underbrush, the weapon leveled at Scarface's chest. That's far enough. 5 heads turned toward him. 5 pairs of eyes measured him and found him wanting. 1 man with a rifle against 5 armed riders. Jacob had been in bad situations before, but this was suicide. Scarface looked at him with something like amusement. Well now, the mysterious buyer. Henry sold you that paint mare, didn't he? Transaction's done. I'm riding out. Then ride. Scarface gestured dismissively. This doesn't concern you. Can't do that. Jacob kept his rifle steady. Man who sold me that horse is bleeding on the ground. These women look like they don't want to go with you. That concerns me. Does it now? Scarface took a step forward. You know who I work for? Don't care. Harrison Calloway. Owns most of the timber rights in this territory. Owns the mining operations. Owns the trading posts. Another step. He wants these women back, and what Mr. Calloway wants, he gets. Not today. Scarface studied Jacob for a long moment. Then he smiled. You got a name, Cowboy? Jacob Bennett. Well, Mr. Bennett, you just made the worst mistake of your life. Scarface's hand moved toward his gun. Boys, kill him! 4 hands went for weapons. Jacob fired. The rifle shot cracked through the clearing like thunder, and Scarface's hat flew off his head, the bullet passing so close it probably singed his hair. Every man froze. Next one goes through the skull, not the hat. Jacob worked the bolt, chambering another round. Now everybody real slow, puts their guns on the ground. Nobody moved. The standoff stretched into seconds that felt like hours. Jacob's mind raced. He had maybe 3 more shots before they rushed him. He couldn't kill all 5. Probably couldn't kill 2 before they returned fire. This was how he died. Over $20 and a question. Then the older woman picked up a rifle one of the men had dropped and pointed it at the nearest rider. Her hands didn't shake. Do what he says, she commanded. The younger sister grabbed a pistol from the ground near Henry's unconscious form. Now it was 3 armed against 5, and the odds had shifted just enough to give the men pause. Scarface's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. You're all dead. You know that, right? Calloway will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Maybe, Jacob gestured with his rifle. But you'll be dead long before that happens if you don't drop those weapons right now. One by one, reluctantly, the men pulled their pistols and let them fall. Jacob exhaled slowly, not quite believing it had worked. Now get on your horses and ride. What about our guns? Consider them payment for the old man's medical bills. Jacob motioned toward Henry, who was starting to stir. Move. The men mounted, Scarface last. He looked at Jacob with pure hatred. Calloway will hear about this. Every detail. And then he'll come for all of you. Let him come. They rode out and Jacob watched until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did he lower his rifle and let himself shake. The older woman rushed to Henry's side. "Papa, can you hear me?" Henry's eyes fluttered open. Blood ran down his face from the gash on his scalp, but he was alive. He looked at Jacob standing there with his rifle, looked at his daughters safe beside him, and something like relief crossed his weathered features. "You asked questions," Henry whispered. "And you stayed for answers." Jacob holstered his rifle and moved to help. "Yeah, well, turns out $20 bought me more than a horse." The younger woman looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "You saved our lives. Why? You don't even know us." Jacob thought about that. About how he'd been ready to ride away and save himself. About how something in Henry's desperate gamble had pulled at a part of him he thought he'd buried years ago. "Your father made a bet," Jacob said quietly. "Figured I should see it through." Henry gripped Jacob's arm weakly. "They will come back, many more. You need to run. We all need to run." Jacob looked at the two women. "And I'm guessing you don't have horses anymore." The older woman shook her head. "They took ours 2 days ago. That's why my father—" Her voice broke. "That's why he sold you the mare." "It was the only way to get us out." Jacob closed his eyes. Of course. The whole transaction had been a desperate father trying to save his daughters with the only resource he had left. The $20 had never mattered. What mattered was getting that horse away from the camp before Calloway's men showed up, but Jacob had come back. And now all 4 of them were targets. "Can he ride?" Jacob asked, looking at Henry's wound. "I can ride," Henry insisted, though his face was pale. "Then we move now. Because when those men reach Calloway, he's going to send everyone he has." Jacob met the eyes of the two women. "I need to know your names if we're going to survive this." "Margaret," the older one said. "Margaret Blackfeather. This is my sister Sarah. Well, Margaret and Sarah Blackfeather, I'm Jacob Bennett, and I just spent $20 on the most expensive horse in Montana Territory." He checked his rifle and started gathering the dropped weapons. "Now let's make sure we all live long enough for me to regret it." They had maybe 2 hours before Calloway's men returned with reinforcements. Jacob knew that, like he knew, the sun would set. Certain and unavoidable. He worked quickly, gathering supplies from what remained of Henry's camp, while Margaret tended to her father's head wound. Sarah stood watch at the tree line, gripping the pistol she'd picked up. Her hands had stopped shaking, but Jacob could see the tension in her shoulders. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 19, with her sister's same determined jaw, but eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide fear. "How bad?" Jacob asked Margaret as she tied off a bandage around Henry's skull. "He needs proper medical attention." "This is just to stop the bleeding." Margaret's voice was steady, controlled. The kind of calm that came from forcing yourself not to panic. "He's got a concussion, maybe worse." Henry tried to sit up. "I can ride. We go now." "You can barely stand," Margaret countered, but there was no arguing with the look in her father's eyes. He would ride or die trying, and they all knew staying meant dying anyway. Jacob made a decision. "Margaret, you ride with your father on the mare. Keep him steady. Sarah rides with me on one of their horses." He gestured to the mounts Calloway's men had left behind in their hasty retreat. "You're taking us with you." Sarah turned from her post, surprise evident in her voice. "Why would you do that?" "You could ride faster alone." "Could," Jacob admitted, checking the saddle on a sturdy roan gelding. "But your father spent his last $20 betting I wouldn't. Seems wrong to prove him a fool." "You don't understand what you're getting into." Margaret helped Henry to his feet. "Harrison Calloway doesn't just own businesses. He owns sheriffs, judges, territorial officials. He's untouchable. Nobody's untouchable." Jacob swung into the saddle, then reached down to help Sarah up behind him. "They all bleed the same." "That's not confidence talking," Margaret said, studying him. "That's experience." "Who are you really, Jacob Bennett?" Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he urged the gelding forward, leading them northeast away from the camp. Behind them, smoke began to rise. Sarah had set fire to what remained of their shelters on her father's instruction. If they couldn't have it, Calloway's men wouldn't find anything useful in the ashes. They rode hard for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and the inevitable pursuit. Henry slumped against Margaret, conscious but drifting. Every few minutes she'd speak to him quietly, keeping him aware, keeping him fighting. Sarah's arms wrapped around Jacob's waist for balance. She was silent for most of the ride, but finally spoke as they crested a ridge overlooking a valley of golden aspens. "My father has been planning this for 6 months." Jacob glanced back at her. "Planning what exactly?" "Our escape. Harrison Calloway decided he wanted to marry Margaret. Told my father it would be an honor to have his daughter join one of the territory's most prominent families." Sarah's voice dripped with disgust. "When my father refused, Calloway made it clear refusal wasn't an option. So he's been threatening you. Worse than threats. 3 months ago, Calloway's men burned down the Matthews family cabin. Mr. Matthews had refused to sell his land." Sarah's grip tightened. "They found the bodies a week later. All 5 of them, including 2 children. Jacob felt ice slide down his spine. "And the law did nothing?" "The sheriff ruled it an accidental fire." "Faulty stove," Margaret called from behind them, having overheard. "The same sheriff who gets paid by Calloway to look the other way." They descended into the valley, following a creek that would hide their tracks. Jacob's mind worked through the implications. This wasn't just about refusing a marriage proposal. This was about a man so powerful he could murder families and call it an accident, who could take whatever he wanted because nobody dared stop him. "Why does he specifically want you?" Jacob asked Margaret. "Man like that could have any woman in the territory." "Because my father owns water rights." Margaret's voice went hard. "The creek that runs through our land feeds into the main river system. Calloway's timber operations need that water to float logs downstream. He's been trying to buy the rights for 2 years. "Let me guess," Jacob said. "Your father won't sell." "Can't sell," Henry rasped, his voice weak but determined. "Water rights belong to the tribe, passed down through my mother's line. I'm only guardian. To sell would betray everyone who came before. So Calloway figured if he married Margaret, the rights would transfer to him eventually." Jacob finished. "And if she refused, he'd take her anyway and worry about the legalities later. He sent his men to our home 2 weeks ago," Sarah continued. "They said Margaret had 3 days to accept the proposal or they'd come back for both of us. That's when Papa sold everything we had, our extra horses, our winter supplies, anything of value. He was trying to buy us passage east, somewhere Calloway couldn't reach. But word travels," Margaret added bitterly. "Every trading post, every settlement. They all knew to watch for 2 native women traveling alone. Calloway has eyes everywhere." Jacob understood now why Henry had seemed so desperate. The old man had been trapped, running out of time and options, watching the noose tighten around his daughters. The $20 horse sale had been his last gamble. Send the horse away with a stranger. Hope that stranger had enough decency to help when the truth revealed itself. "That's why you came back," Margaret said, and it wasn't a question. Papa knew if he picked the right man, someone with honor, they wouldn't be able to ride away when Calloway's men showed up. "Your father's either very smart or very desperate." "Both," Henry murmured. "I chose you because 2 years ago you stopped a lynching in Silver Creek. 3 men wanted to hang a native boy for stealing cattle he didn't take. You stood between them and that boy with just your rifle and your word." Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. He remembered Silver Creek, remembering the mob drunk on whiskey and prejudice. Remembered the terrified kid, barely 16, pleading his innocence while a rope got fitted around his neck. "How do you know about that?" "The boy's father is my brother. You saved my nephew's life." Henry coughed, and Margaret steadied him. "When I needed someone brave and foolish enough to stand against Calloway, I asked around. Your name came up more than once, as brave or foolish." "Both," Henry repeated, the ghost of a smile on his bloodied face. "Men said you don't walk away from injustice. Even walking away would be smarter." Sarah shifted behind Jacob. "So you do this often? Rescue people you don't know?" Not often enough to be good at it, Jacob admitted. Usually end up shot or broke. Sometimes both. Yet you do it anyway. Jacob thought about that question, about all the times he'd inserted himself into other people's problems, about the scars he carried and the enemies he'd made, about why a man with nothing would risk the little he had for strangers. My father used to say the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching, Jacob said quietly. It's what he does when he could walk away and nobody would blame him. They rode in silence after that, climbing higher into the foothills. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, beautiful and completely indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath it. Jacob called a halt near a stream where the horses could drink. Henry needed rest, though he protested weakly. Margaret helped him down from the saddle, and he immediately vomited into the bushes, a bad sign for his head injury. "We can't stop for long," Jacob said, scanning the terrain behind them. "They'll have picked up our trail by now. Then maybe we should talk about where we're actually going." Margaret wrung out a cloth in the stream and pressed it to her father's forehead. "You mentioned the mountain pass, but that's 3 days of hard riding for healthy men. We're not making it in 3 days, not with Papa like this." Jacob had been thinking the same thing. The northern pass was their best chance to escape Calloway's territory, but Henry was in no condition for that kind of journey. They needed somewhere to hole up, somewhere defensible, where they could make a stand if necessary. "There's an old mining camp about 6 hours northeast," Jacob said slowly, remembering the maps he'd studied. "Abandoned silver mine. The claim played out 5 years ago, but the building should still be standing. Calloway will check every abandoned camp in the territory," Sarah protested. "Eventually. But we need time, and that camp gives us shelter and high ground." Jacob met Margaret's eyes. "Your father needs more than a cold camp and a wet cloth. He needs rest, warmth, and time for that head wound to stabilize. Or time for Calloway's men to surround us," Margaret countered. But there was no real argument in her voice. She knew Jacob was right. Henry grabbed Jacob's wrist with surprising strength. "There is another reason we need time. Another reason Calloway wants me dead is beyond the water rights." "Papa, don't," Margaret started, but Henry cut her off. "He needs to know. They all need to know what they're protecting." Henry struggled to sit up straighter, his eyes fever bright. "I have evidence. Written testimony from 12 people about Calloway's crimes. Murders, arsons, stolen land claims, bribes paid to officials. Everything needed to bring him to trial." Jacob felt his stomach drop. "Where is this evidence?" "Hidden. Safe." Henry tapped his chest. "Location is here, in my memory. Calloway knows I gathered it. That's why he needs me dead before I can deliver it to someone who matters." "Who matters?" Jacob asked. "You said he owns the sheriffs and judges." "Not all of them. There's a federal marshal coming through the territory next month, Thomas Wardle. He has a reputation for being incorruptible." Henry's voice grew stronger, fueled by desperate urgency. "If I can survive until he arrives, if I can put that evidence in his hands, Calloway will hang." "And if Calloway finds us first?" Sarah asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. "Then he kills me, burns the evidence, and takes you both anyway," Henry said bluntly. "Which is why Jacob's plan makes sense. We hide, we heal, and we wait for Marshal Wardle." "A month," Margaret breathed. "We have to survive a month with Calloway hunting us." "Not just survive," Jacob corrected. "We have to stay hidden from a man who owns half the territory and has unlimited resources to find us." He looked at each of them in turn. "And we have to do it with an injured man, limited supplies, and winter coming fast." The weight of impossibility settled over them like a shroud. 1 month, 4 people against an army. Long odds didn't begin to describe it. "Why didn't you just send the evidence with someone else?" Jacob asked. "Why risk your daughter's lives by staying?" "Because I tried that already," Henry said bitterly. 2 months ago, I gave copies to a man I trusted, a minister who promised to carry them east to the territorial capital. He paused, his jaw working. They found him 3 weeks later in a ravine, broken neck. The evidence was gone. Calloway has people everywhere, Margaret explained. Anyone we asked for help either worked for him or was too terrified to risk their families. We were alone, trapped, waiting for either Calloway's men or Marshal Wardell to arrive first. Until Papa heard about you, Sarah added. Heard that you'd helped others for no reason, except it was right. He gambled everything on you being the man the stories claimed. Jacob looked at the three of them. A wounded old man with a target on his back, 2 young women who'd been hunted from their home, all of them putting their faith in a drifter they'd known for less than 4 hours. Your father bet $20 on a stranger, Jacob said quietly. That might be the worst investment in Montana history. Or the best, Henry countered, his eyes sharp despite the pain. Because you came back. When you could have ridden away rich by $20 and one magnificent horse, you came back. That tells me everything I need to know about Jacob Bennett. It tells you I'm a fool who can't mind his own business. It tells me you're exactly the man we needed. Margaret stood, decision made. So, where is this mining camp? And how do we get there before dark? Jacob pulled out his map and spread it on the ground. The abandoned silver mine sat in a valley, surrounded by steep ridges, defensible but isolated, one way in, one way out. It could be their fortress or their tomb, depending on how things played out. We'll reach it by midnight if we push hard, Jacob said, tracing the route. But they'll be tracking us. We need to split up, leave false trails, make them work for it. Split up? Sarah's voice rose. That's how people die in these situations. It's also how some people survive. Jacob looked at Henry. Can you ride? Alone for 2 hours, just straight northeast following the creek? I can ride. Margaret, you go with him. Sarah and I will take the gelding west for an hour, then circle back. With luck they'll follow our tracks and waste time chasing ghosts. And if they split their forces? Margaret challenged. Then we fight. Jacob checked his rifle, then the pistols they'd taken from Calloway's men. But they're overconfident. They think they're chasing an old man and 2 women. They won't expect organized resistance. They're expecting you now, though, Sarah pointed out. That man, the one with the scar, he saw you fight. He knows you're with us. Jacob nodded grimly. Which means when they come back, they'll come heavy. More men, better weapons, probably dogs to track our scent. He met each of their eyes. I need you all to understand something. From this moment on, we're at war. A war against a man with more money and power than we can imagine. The odds of us surviving until Marshal Wardell arrives are slim. How slim? Margaret asked. I'd say 1 in 10 if I was being optimistic. Henry laughed, then winced at the pain it caused. 1 in 10. I've bet on worse odds. This isn't a game, Papa, Margaret said sharply. No, it's survival. Henry gripped his daughter's hand, and sometimes survival means accepting terrible odds and fighting anyway because the alternative is surrender. I will not surrender my daughters to Harrison Calloway. I will not let that man destroy everything my ancestors protected. So we take our 1 in 10 chance, and we make it count. Sarah looked at Jacob. You really think we can do this? 4 people against Calloway's entire operation? Jacob thought about all the times he'd faced impossible odds. About the miners at Silver Creek. About the homesteaders he'd defended from claim jumpers. About every fight where logic said run, but something deeper said stand. I think we have something Calloway doesn't, Jacob said finally. What's that? Nothing left to lose. Calloway fights to protect his empire. We fight because if we don't, we die. That makes us dangerous. He stood and gathered the reins. Now mount up. We've got 6 hours of hard riding ahead, and I want to be in that mining camp before Calloway's dogs pick up our scent. They divided as planned, Henry and Margaret heading northeast along the creek, Jacob and Sarah taking the gelding west before doubling back. As Jacob watched the old man and his eldest daughter disappear into the pine forest, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. $20. That's what this had cost him. Every cent he had in the world. And now he was responsible for 3 lives in a war against a man who commanded an army. Sarah's arms wrapped around his waist as they rode west, and Jacob could feel her trembling despite her brave face. "We're going to die, aren't we?" she whispered. Jacob thought about lying, about offering false comfort. But these people had gambled everything on his honesty. "Maybe," he admitted, "but we're going to make Calloway bleed for every inch of ground, and if we're lucky, we'll survive long enough to see him hang. And if we're not lucky, then we'll die, knowing we stood for something that mattered. That's more than most people get." They rode into the growing darkness, and behind them, Jacob could already hear the baying of dogs in the distance. The hunt had begun. The dogs sounded closer than they should have been. Jacob had counted on at least 3 hours before Calloway's men could organize a proper hunting party, but the baying echoed through the valley after only 90 minutes. Either they'd moved faster than expected, or Calloway had resources positioned throughout the territory. Jacob pulled the gelding to a stop near a rocky outcrop. Sarah slid off behind him, her face pale in the moonlight that had begun filtering through the clouds. "They're gaining," she said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be said aloud to make it real. "They're following our trail west exactly like we wanted." Jacob dismounted and pulled his rifle. "Now we make them pay for it." He led Sarah and the horse up into the rocks, finding a position that overlooked the trail they'd just traveled. The outcrop provided cover and elevation, 2 advantages Jacob desperately needed since they were outmanned and outgunned. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked as Jacob checked his ammunition. "We should be running. Can't outrun dogs. Can't outrun horses when they know the terrain." Jacob positioned himself behind a boulder. "But we can slow them down, make them cautious, buy Margaret and your father more time to reach the mining camp." "By fighting? There could be 12 men down there. Then we make them think there's more of us up here." Jacob handed Sarah one of the pistols. "When I start shooting, you fire 3 shots in different directions. Don't aim at anything, just make noise. Make them think they've ridden into an ambush." Sarah took the pistol with shaking hands. "I've never shot at a person before." "You're still not shooting at people, just shooting." Jacob met her eyes. "Can you do this?" She nodded, though her face said otherwise. But sometimes courage wasn't about feeling brave. It was about doing what needed to be done despite the terror. Jacob had learned that lesson years ago in places he tried not to remember. The dogs appeared first, 3 of them, pulling against their leads held by men on horseback. Jacob counted 6 riders in total, all armed, moving in a loose formation that suggested they expected an easy chase. Not a fight. They were about to learn differently. Jacob waited until they were directly below the outcrop, until he could see their faces in the moonlight. Then he fired. The lead rider's hat flew off his head. The man yelped and dove from his saddle just as Sarah began firing blindly into the night. The other riders scattered, shouting in confusion, their horses panicking at the sudden gunfire echoing off the rocks. Jacob worked the rifle's bolt and fired again, this time aiming for the horses. He hated doing it. The animals were innocent in all this. But a man on foot was easier to avoid than a man mounted. His bullet caught one horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed and bucked, throwing its rider hard into the ground. "There's more than one shooter," someone yelled below. "Take cover!" The men dismounted quickly, professional enough to find shelter even while confused. They began returning fire, bullets sparking off the rocks around Jacob and Sarah, but they were shooting blind, unsure of how many enemies they faced or where exactly the shots were coming from. Jacob grabbed Sarah's arm. "Now we run." They scrambled back to where they'd left the gelding, mounted quickly, and rode hard northeast. Behind them, the shooting continued for another minute, before someone realized the ambush had been a delaying tactic. Jacob heard angry shouting, heard someone barking orders. "How much time did that buy us?" Sarah asked, clinging to Jacob as they navigated the dark terrain. "Maybe 30 minutes, maybe less." Jacob pushed the gelding faster than was safe in the darkness, trusting the horse's instincts to avoid the worst hazards. But we rattled them, made them cautious. Every minute they spend being cautious is a minute your father gets farther away. They rode for an hour, always northeast, always climbing higher into the foothills. The temperature dropped as elevation increased. Jacob's breath fogged in the cold air, and he could feel Sarah shivering behind him despite her heavy coat. The mining camp appeared suddenly around a bend, a cluster of wooden buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky. 3 structures remained standing: the main operations building, a bunkhouse, and what looked like a storage shed. All showed signs of abandonment and weather damage, but the walls were intact and the roofs mostly whole. Margaret emerged from the main building as they approached, rifle in hand. She lowered it when she recognized them. "Thank God, we heard the gunfire." She helped Sarah down from the horse. "How many were there?" "6 that we saw. Could be more spreading out to cover ground." Jacob dismounted and led the gelding to what remained of a corral. "How's your father?" "Sleeping. The ride here nearly killed him, but at least we're under shelter now." Margaret looked back at the building. "This place is defensible, but it's also a trap if they surround us." "Everything's a trap if they surround us." Jacob unsaddled the horse, giving the animal a chance to rest. "The question is whether they can find us before morning. If we get through tonight, we can scout proper defensive positions tomorrow." Sarah spoke up, her voice small. "What if they bring more men? What if Calloway himself comes? Then we adapt." Jacob checked his rifle, counting his remaining ammunition. 12 rounds left. Not nearly enough if it came to a prolonged fight. But right now, we need rest. We've been running on fear and adrenaline. That runs out eventually. Margaret led them inside the main building. Henry lay on a makeshift bed of old canvas and saddle blankets, his breathing steady, but his face worryingly pale. Someone had cleaned his wound properly and applied a better bandage. A small fire burned in what remained of a potbelly stove, providing minimal heat but welcome light. "We found some supplies the miners left behind," Margaret explained. "Canned goods, mostly spoiled, but there were a few sealed tins that might still be good. Some rope, tools, a pickaxe." Jacob inventoried what they had: 2 rifles, 4 pistols, maybe 60 rounds of mixed ammunition, 3 horses, minimal food, no medical supplies beyond what they could improvise. Against that, Calloway had unlimited men, unlimited ammunition, and the backing of every corrupt official in the territory. "We need a plan beyond hiding," Jacob said, sitting near the fire. "Calloway won't stop looking. Eventually, someone will remember this mining camp and they'll come check it. So what do you suggest?" Margaret joined him by the fire, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "We can't fight an army. We can't outrun them forever, and Papa needs weeks to recover, not days." Jacob stared into the flames, his mind working through possibilities that all seemed to end in death. Then an idea began forming, dangerous and probably insane, but maybe their only real chance. "What if we don't hide?" he said slowly. "What if we make Calloway come to us on our terms?" "That's suicide," Margaret said flatly. "So is sitting here waiting to be found." Jacob met her eyes. "Your father has evidence that can destroy Calloway. That makes him terrified. Terrified men make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? The kind where they commit so many resources to one target that they leave themselves exposed elsewhere." Jacob pulled out his map, spreading it near the firelight. "Calloway's power comes from 3 things: his timber operation, his mining interests, and his control over the water system. What if we hit one of those?" Sarah had been listening from where she sat near her father. "Hit how?" "We're 4 people. 4 people can start a fire. 4 people can sabotage equipment. 4 people can make Calloway bleed money." Jacob traced lines on the map. "His main timber mill is 10 miles south of here, near the river. If that mill burns, he loses months of processed lumber and the income it represents. He'd also know exactly who did it," Margaret countered. It would bring every man he has down on us. It would bring every man he has to the mill site, searching for us, while we're actually somewhere else entirely. Jacob's plan crystallized as he spoke. We hit the mill, make it look like we're heading south toward the territorial border, then circle back here. With luck, they'd chase ghosts for days. Margaret studied the map, her expression skeptical but considering. And what if they don't chase? What if they post guards at every possible hideout and wait for us to starve? Then we've bought time and cost Calloway money. Both of those work in our favor. Jacob looked at Henry's sleeping form. Your father needs 3 weeks minimum before he can travel safely. We need to keep Calloway distracted and disorganized for 3 weeks. This could do that. Or it could get us all killed faster, Sarah said quietly. That's also possible, Jacob admitted. But right now, Calloway has all the advantages. He knows this territory, he has unlimited resources, and he can wait as long as it takes. We need to change that equation, make him reactive instead of proactive, make him scared instead of confident. Margaret was silent for a long moment, weighing the insanity of attacking one of the most powerful men in Montana territory. Finally, she spoke. When would we do this? Tomorrow night. Gives us a day to rest, scout the mill and prepare. Jacob rolled up the map. But I'm not ordering anyone to come. This is volunteer work for a cause that might get us killed. Everything about this situation might get us killed, Margaret pointed out. At least your plan has us fighting back instead of just hiding like prey. Sarah stood and moved to the fire, holding her hands out to warm them. I'll come. If we're going to die anyway, I'd rather die making Calloway pay than cowering in an abandoned mine. Jacob looked at these two. Women, barely more than girls really, committing to an act of sabotage against a man who'd already demonstrated his willingness to murder families. He wanted to tell them to stay safe, to let him handle it alone. But they weren't asking for permission. They were claiming their right to fight back against the man who destroyed their lives. We rest until dawn, Jacob said. Then we scout the mill and plan our approach. Margaret, you'll stay here with your father. Sarah and I will handle the actual sabotage. Like hell, Margaret said sharply. You need someone who knows Calloway's operations, who can identify which buildings matter most. That's me. And leave your father alone? My father is unconscious and needs rest, not a nursemaid. Margaret's jaw set stubbornly. Besides, if something happens to you too, someone needs to survive to tell Marshal Wardell what happened. Papa can do that if necessary. Jacob recognized the futility of arguing. These women had spent too long being hunted, being treated as property to be claimed. They were done running scared. Fine. All 3 of us go tomorrow night. We move fast, we hit hard, and we're gone before they know what happened. Jacob checked the door, ensuring it was secure. But tonight we sleep in shifts, 2 hours each on watch. If you see anything at all, you wake everyone immediately. They settled into an uneasy rest, taking turns at the window watching the dark forest for signs of pursuit. The dogs had gone quiet, which worried Jacob more than the baying had. Either Calloway's men had lost the trail, or they'd found it and were moving in quietly. Jacob took the midnight watch, staring out at the silver landscape painted by a moon that seemed too bright, too revealing. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could signal the approach of men with guns and bad intentions. Henry stirred around 2 in the morning, waking from his fitful sleep. He tried to sit up, grimaced, and settled for turning his head toward Jacob. You're planning something foolish. Henry whispered, his voice rough. How do you know? Because you have that look. Same look my nephew described from Silver Creek. The look of a man about to do something brave and stupid. Henry coughed weakly. What is it? Jacob explained the mill plan in brief, quiet sentences. Henry listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable in the dim firelight. When Jacob finished, Henry was silent for a long time. Then, my daughters are going with you. I tried to stop them. Good. They should go. Henry's eyes found Jacob's in the darkness. Not because I want them in danger, but because they need to feel like they're fighting back. Being hunted turns you into prey. Fighting back reminds you you're human, even if fighting back gets them killed. Better to die than live as prey. Henry's hand reached out, gripping Jacob's arm with surprising strength. You understand this? I see it in you. Whatever happened to you, wherever you come from, you learned that lesson the hard way. Jacob thought about the places he'd been, the things he'd done and seen, about the choices that had shaped him into someone who couldn't walk away from injustice, even when walking away was the smart move. My father was a sheriff, Jacob said quietly, words he rarely spoke aloud. Small town in Colorado. When I was 17, a mining company wanted the land where our town sat. They offered to buy everyone out. Most people took the deal, but my father refused. Said a man doesn't abandon his post just because staying gets difficult. What happened? The mining company sent men, 20 of them armed and angry. They gave my father one last chance to leave. He stood in the middle of Main Street with his badge and his rifle and told them to go to hell. Jacob's voice went flat, emotionless. They killed him where he stood, shot him down like a dog while I watched from inside the sheriff's office. Henry's grip tightened. And you? I was supposed to stay hidden. That's what he told me before he walked out there. But I couldn't just watch. Jacob's jaw worked. I grabbed a rifle and started shooting. Killed 2 of them before they drove me back. The rest of the town finally found their courage then. We ran those mining company thugs out of Colorado, but my father was already dead. You avenged him. I failed him. Jacob pulled away from Henry's grip. He told me to stay hidden and I didn't listen. Maybe if I had, maybe if they didn't have to worry about shooting a kid, my father would have survived. Or maybe you reminded him why he stood in that street in the first place. Henry said softly. Maybe seeing you refuse to hide gave him the courage to die for something that mattered. Jacob had never thought about it that way. For 15 years, he'd carried the guilt of disobedience, the weight of his father's death. But Henry's words offered a different perspective, that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't survival, but choosing what you'd stand for even when standing meant dying. Your father bet $20 on me, being the man you needed, Jacob said. That bet looks worse every hour. No, that bet looks better. Henry settled back onto his makeshift bed. Because you didn't just take the horse and run. You came back. You're still here. And now you're planning to strike back at a man everyone says is untouchable. He smiled slightly. $20 well spent. Outside, something moved in the darkness. Jacob's hand went to his rifle instantly, his body tensing. He watched the tree line, searching for the source of the movement. A deer emerged from the forest, picking its way cautiously across the clearing toward the old water trough. Just a deer. Jacob exhaled slowly, but the deer suddenly bolted, crashing back into the trees like something had spooked it. And deer didn't spook from nothing. Wake the others, Jacob whispered to Henry. We've got company. He moved to the window, rifle ready, and peered into the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then slowly, shadows began to separate themselves from the tree line. Men on foot, moving carefully, weapons drawn. Jacob counted 5, maybe 6. They were spreading out, attempting to surround the building. Professional tactics. These weren't random hired thugs. These were men who knew how to conduct a nighttime raid. Margaret appeared beside him, already armed. How many? 6 at least. Could be more we can't see. Jacob checked his ammunition again. Still 12 rounds? They're trying to surround us. Then we break out before they complete the circle. Sarah joined them at the window, her face set with determination that barely masked terror. We can't defend this building against that many. We also can't leave your father. Jacob's mind raced through options, all of them bad. Margaret, can Henry ride? Not far. Not fast. Margaret's voice was tight with stress. Moving him now could kill him. Staying here will definitely kill him. Jacob made a decision. Sarah, take the paint mare and ride north. Make noise. Make them think you're all 3 of us fleeing. Lead them away. That's suicide, Sarah protested. It's distraction. There's a difference. Jacob gripped her shoulder. You're the lightest rider, the fastest on that horse. You can outrun them if you stick to high ground. And then what? I'd just leave you all here? You circle back in 2 hours. By then we'll have moved your father to a different location. Jacob looked at Margaret. There's a ravine about a mile east, lots of cover. We can hide there until Sarah returns. Margaret nodded slowly. It could work. If Sarah can draw them off, if we can move Papa without killing him, if they don't have more men waiting. A lot of ifs, Jacob admitted. But it's the best option we've got. The shadows outside were closing in. They had maybe 2 minutes before the circle completed. Maybe 3 before whoever was leading this raid gave the order to attack. Sarah moved toward the door where the horses waited. How will I find you in the ravine? Look for 3 stones stacked on the eastern edge. We'll mark the spot. Jacob checked the window again. The men were 50 yards out now, moving in coordinated bounds. Go now! Ride hard and don't look back. Sarah paused at the door, looking back at her father's sleeping form one last time. Then she was gone, moving like a shadow herself, toward where the paint mare waited. 30 seconds later, they heard hoofbeats exploding into the night. Sarah's voice rang out, a war cry that echoed off the mountains. The paint mare thundered north, and immediately the shadows outside shifted direction. Chasing after the sound, now, Jacob said, helping Margaret lift Henry. The old man groaned, but didn't fully wake as they carried him toward the back door. Behind them, they heard shouting as the men realized they'd been deceived. But Sarah had done her job. She'd pulled most of them away, given Jacob and Margaret a window to escape. They moved into the darkness, carrying Henry between them, heading east toward the ravine, and whatever slim chance at survival waited there. Jacob could hear pursuit starting to reorganize behind them, could hear orders being barked. The hunt wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more desperate phase. And somewhere in the darkness, Sarah rode alone, with half of Calloway's men on her trail, buying time with her life. $20, Jacob thought as they stumbled through the dark forest. Henry Blackfeather had paid $20 for a horse and gotten into a war. The only question now was whether anyone would survive it. The ravine was deeper than Jacob remembered, a jagged tear in the earth carved by centuries of spring runoff. They descended carefully in the pre-dawn darkness, Henry's weight between them, every step a gamble that could send all 3 tumbling to the rocky bottom 30 feet below. Margaret's breath came in ragged gasps. How much farther? 20 yards. There's a shelf with an overhang. Jacob shifted Henry's weight, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. The ambush earlier had taken more out of him than he'd admitted. We can hide there until Sarah returns. If Sarah returns, his mind whispered, but he kept that thought to himself. They reached the shelf just as dawn began painting the eastern sky in shades of grey. The overhang provided cover from above and concealment from below. Anyone searching would have to be right on top of them to see their position. Jacob lowered Henry gently onto the cold stone while Margaret collapsed beside her father, exhausted. We can't keep running like this, she said between gasps. Papa needs medicine, real rest, not another night freezing in a ravine. I know. Jacob positioned himself where he could watch the terrain above. But we're alive, and that's more than Calloway expected by now. Henry stirred, his eyes opening. For a moment, confusion clouded his face. Then awareness returned, bringing pain with it. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Sarah, he rasped. Where is Sarah? Drawing them away. Margaret placed a hand on her father's chest, keeping him down. She'll be back in 2 hours. You let her go alone. Henry's voice rose with alarm. Those men will chase a fast rider on the best horse in the territory and spend all morning realizing they've been fooled. Jacob kept his tone confident, though his gut churned with worry. Sarah's smart and she's motivated. She'll make it. But even as he said it, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley. 3 shots, rapid succession, then silence. Too far away to identify the source, but close enough to send ice through Jacob's veins. Margaret went pale. That could be anyone. Could be them shooting at shadows. Could be. Jacob gripped his rifle tighter. The waiting was always the worst part. The not knowing whether your plan had worked or gotten someone killed. He'd learned that lesson at Silver Creek and relearned it a dozen times since. They waited as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. 1 hour passed. Then 90 minutes. Jacob kept checking his pocket watch, a dented silver piece that had belonged to his father. Each minute that Sarah didn't return felt like confirmation of his worst fears. Then they heard it. Hoofbeats approaching fast from the north, a single rider pushing hard. Jacob tensed, ready to shoot if it was Calloway's men. But the paint mare burst into view, and Sarah was still in the saddle, low and tight, riding like her life depended on speed. Blood stained her left sleeve. Jacob scrambled up to the ravine's edge and whistled sharply, their prearranged signal. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound. She altered course, guiding the exhausted mare toward the ravine. "Riders behind me," she gasped as she dismounted. "Maybe 10 minutes back." "How many?" "4 that I saw. Could be more." Sarah stumbled, and Margaret caught her. "They shot my horse, grazed her shoulder, but she kept running. Then one of them got lucky and winged me." Jacob examined Sarah's arm. The bullet had torn through the outer flesh, painful and bleeding, but not life-threatening if they could keep infection out. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound it tight. "You did good," he told her. "Led them all over creation by the look of it. Led them in circles for an hour." Sarah winced as Margaret tightened the bandage. "They finally figured out I was alone and regrouped. That's when I ran for real. 10 minutes isn't much lead." Jacob helped Henry to his feet, the old man protesting weakly. "We need to move deeper into the ravine, find a place where we can defend if they follow our trail here." They descended another 100 yards, the ravine narrowing until they could almost touch both walls. Jacob found a spot where the path bent sharply, a natural choke point. If Calloway's men followed, they'd have to come single file around that bend, exposing themselves with each step. "This is where we make our stand, if it comes to that," Jacob said, positioning himself with a clear line of fire. "Margaret, take Sarah and your father back another 50 yards. If shooting starts, you keep moving east. The ravine opens into a canyon that runs 5 miles. You can lose them there. What about you?" Margaret demanded. "I'll slow them down, then catch up. That's a suicide plan." "It's a survival plan." "My survival depends on yours." Jacob met her eyes. "Your father has the evidence that can destroy Calloway. If he dies, if those papers never reach Marshal Wardell, then everything, all of this running and bleeding and dying, means nothing. So you 3 live, no matter what that costs." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but Henry spoke first, his voice weak but firm. "He's right. The evidence is what matters. Not me, not any of us individually. The evidence. Papa..." "Listen to him, Margaret." Henry gripped his daughter's hand. "Jacob understands what we're fighting for. It's bigger than family, bigger than survival. It's about stopping a monster from destroying everyone else the way he destroyed us." They heard voices then, echoing down the ravine. Calloway's men had found the trail. Jacob could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, maybe a 4th. Not overwhelming numbers, but enough to be deadly in close quarters. "Go now," Jacob whispered urgently. "Don't look back, don't stop." "I'll find you." Margaret hesitated one more second, her eyes holding something Jacob couldn't quite read. Then she was moving, helping Sarah support Henry as they disappeared around the ravine's next bend. Jacob settled into position behind a boulder, rifle ready. His hands were steady, despite the fear coursing through him. This part he knew. The waiting before violence, the certainty that in the next few minutes someone would bleed, maybe die. He'd lived through it before. Probably wouldn't survive it forever, but not today. Today he had people depending on him. The first man appeared around the bend, moving cautiously, rifle raised. Jacob didn't shoot, waited. The man took 2 more steps, then a third. Behind him, another shadow appeared now. Jacob fired. The first man went down, grabbing his leg where Jacob's bullet had shattered his knee. The second man dove back around the corner, shouting warnings. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off stone around Jacob's position. He worked the bolt and fired again, aiming high, keeping them pinned. Then he moved, scrambling back 20 feet to a new position before they could triangulate his location. Old cavalry tactics his father had taught him. Shoot and move. Never stay static. Make them think you're everywhere at once. "How many are there?" Someone shouted from behind the bend. "Can't tell. At least 2, maybe more." "Good, let them overestimate." Jacob fired twice more, then retreated another 30 feet. The wounded man was screaming, the sound echoing off the ravine walls. His companions would have to either leave him or slow down to help. Either choice worked in Jacob's favor. But then a new voice cut through the chaos. Calm, educated, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Mr. Bennett, that is you, isn't it?" Jacob froze. He knew that voice, though he'd never heard it before. Harrison Calloway had come personally. "I know you're protecting the Blackfeather family," Calloway continued, his voice echoing. "I understand why. Henry probably told you some sob story about victimization, about Big Bad Calloway stealing land and murdering innocents." Jacob didn't respond, kept moving backward, keeping distance between himself and that voice. "Did he tell you about his nephew, the one who killed a homesteader's daughter 3 years ago?" Calloway's words were smooth as silk. "Or that Henry himself has been running an illegal timber operation, undercutting legitimate businesses like mine?" Lies had to be lies. But doubt crept in anyway, the way it always did when someone with power and education challenged your assumptions. "You seem like a reasonable man. Mr. Bennett, a man who understands that every story has two sides." Calloway stepped into view around the bend, hands raised and empty, wearing an expensive suit that looked absurd in a Montana ravine. "So let me offer you the other side." He was flanked by 4 men with rifles, but none of them were aiming at Jacob. Not yet. This was theater. Calloway demonstrating confidence, showing he wasn't afraid of one man with a gun. Jacob kept his rifle trained on Calloway's chest, but didn't fire. "Say your piece. I came to this territory 15 years ago with nothing. Built an empire through hard work and fair dealing." Calloway's face was handsome in a weathered way, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Henry Blackfeather sits on land he inherited through his mother's tribal connections, land he doesn't use, doesn't develop, doesn't benefit from except to prevent others from prospering. He has a right to that land, does he?" Calloway took a step forward. Should one old man's stubbornness prevent progress? Prevent jobs for hundreds of settlers? Prevent this territory from reaching its potential? Funny how your idea of progress involves burning families alive. Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger. "The Matthews family. Want to explain that?" Calloway's expression didn't change. "A tragedy, a terrible accident that my competitors used to slander me. The territorial investigation found no evidence of arson. Because you own the investigators. I don't own anyone. Mr. Bennett, I simply employ people who understand that civilization requires order, and order requires someone to make difficult decisions." Calloway gestured to the wounded man, still groaning on the ground. "Like you just made. You shot Davis there because you believed you were protecting innocent people. But what if I told you Margaret Blackfeather has a warrant for theft? That Sarah assaulted one of my mill foremen? I'd say you're a liar. Warrants are a matter of public record. I can show you the paperwork." Calloway pulled a folded document from his jacket. "See for yourself." Margaret stole $300 from a trading post. The owner didn't want to press charges because she's native, because he felt sorry for her. But the law doesn't care about sympathy. Jacob's mind raced. The document looked official, complete with stamps and signatures. But documents could be forged, especially by someone with Calloway's resources. "Why are you telling me this?" Jacob asked. "Because I don't want to kill you, Mr. Bennett. You're not part of this. You're just a drifter who made an unfortunate deal with the wrong people." Calloway's voice dropped, becoming almost sympathetic. "Walk away. Right now. I'll even pay you for your trouble. Say $100. You leave the Blackfeathers to me, you ride out of this territory, and you forget any of this happened. $100. 5 times what Jacob had paid for the horse. Enough to make it through winter comfortably. Enough to buy supplies and start fresh somewhere. Calloway's reach couldn't extend. All he had to do was abandon an old man and 2 women to whatever fate Calloway had planned. "What happens to them if I leave?" Jacob asked quietly. "The women face justice for their crimes. Henry and I come to an agreement about the water rights." Calloway smiled. "Civilized resolution to an unfortunate situation. Civilized like what happened to the Matthews family." Calloway's smile didn't waver. "I've made my offer, Mr. Bennett. $100 and safe passage, or you die in this ravine protecting people who lied to you about who they really are." Jacob thought about his father standing in that Colorado street, badge on his chest, rifle in his hands. Thought about the choice his father had made, die for a principle or live by compromising it. His father had chosen death. And for 15 years, Jacob had wondered if that choice had been brave or just stupid. Now, facing his own version of that choice, Jacob finally understood. It wasn't about bravery or stupidity. It was about looking in a mirror afterward and recognizing the person looking back. "Your $100, Jacob said slowly. "Does it come with an explanation for why you burned the Clark's homestead last year? Or why Thomas McCready disappeared after refusing to sell you his mining claim?" Calloway's smile faded. "You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Jacob raised his rifle a fraction higher. "Now you and your men turn around and walk away, or I put a bullet through that expensive suit. You can't kill all of us." "Don't need to kill all of you. Just you. Maybe your men keep coming after that. Maybe they decide their pay isn't worth dying for. Either way, you don't live to see it." The standoff stretched. Calloway's men shifted nervously, hands moving toward weapons, but not drawing. They were reading the situation, calculating odds, wondering if Jacob was bluffing. Jacob wasn't bluffing. "You're protecting murderers and thieves," Calloway said, his voice hardening. "When this territory learns what you've done, you'll be hunted as an outlaw. Then I'll have something in common with you, won't I?" Jacob took a step back, maintaining distance. "Difference is, I'll sleep fine knowing I stood with the people you were trying to destroy." Calloway's mask of civility finally cracked, revealing the predator beneath. "Kill him! Kill them all! I want this finished today." His men raised their rifles, and Jacob knew he'd run out of time for words. He fired, aiming not at Calloway but at the man to his left. The shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. Jacob bolted, running as gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets whined past his head. Stone fragments peppered his back. He zigzagged, using every bit of cover, moving deeper into the ravine where Calloway's men couldn't get clean shots. He rounded a bend and nearly collided with Margaret, who'd come back despite his orders. She grabbed his arm and pulled him into a narrow side passage he'd missed in his initial survey. "This way," she hissed. Sarah found a cave. They squeezed through the passage, emerging in a wider section of ravine where Sarah waited with Henry. Behind them, they could hear Calloway's men approaching, more cautious now. "Having learned that charging blindly got you shot, there's a cave." Jacob gasped, checking his ammunition. 4 rounds left, more like a crack in the rock wall, but it goes deep. Sarah pointed to what looked like a shadow between 2 boulders. "We can hide there, wait for them out. They'll find us eventually." Margaret helped her father toward the cave entrance. "But maybe eventually it gives us options." Jacob covered their retreat, watching the passage they'd come through. He could hear Calloway shouting orders, organizing his men for a systematic search. The man was smart, methodical. He wouldn't make the mistake of rushing again. They squeezed into the crack, finding it opened into a small chamber maybe 10 feet across. Cold, dark, but defensible. One way in meant one way to defend. Henry collapsed against the rear wall, his breathing labored. The running and stress had taken a severe toll. Margaret knelt beside him, checking his pulse, her face grim, his heart's racing. "We push him any harder, it's gonna give out?" She looked at Jacob. "We're out of options. Can't run, can't hide much longer, can't fight. Then we negotiate," Jacob said, though the word tasted like ash. "Negotiate what?" "You heard Calloway. He wants us dead. He wants the evidence more than he wants revenge." Jacob pulled Henry's coat aside, searching for where the old man had hidden the documents. "We give him the evidence, maybe he lets us walk." "No." Henry's hand shot out, gripping Jacob's wrist with surprising strength. "You give him those papers, he burns them and kills us anyway. The evidence is the only leverage we have. Leverage isn't worth anything if we're dead. Then we die with it." Henry's eyes were fierce despite his weakness. "Those papers represent 12 families destroyed by Calloway. 37 people dead. If we surrender them, those deaths mean nothing. Calloway wins, and he'll keep winning until someone stops him. Sarah spoke from the cave entrance where she stood watch. Marshal Wardell arrives in 3 weeks. If we can just survive 3 weeks, we won't survive 3 hours at this rate, Margaret interrupted. Papa's dying, we're trapped, and Calloway has unlimited men. We need a miracle. Jacob thought about miracles, about $20 buying a horse and getting into a war, about choices that seemed impossible until you stopped looking for good options and accepted that sometimes there were only bad options and worse options. The mill, he said suddenly. Your father's evidence, where exactly is it hidden? In a safe place. Henry's eyes narrowed. Why? Because maybe we don't need to wait 3 weeks. Maybe we force Calloway's hand right now. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities. You said Marshal Wardell is incorruptible. What if we get word to him early? What if we make so much noise that he has to come investigate? How? Margaret demanded. We're trapped in a cave. The evidence names names, right? Specific crimes, specific dates. Jacob met Henry's eyes. What if we didn't just hide it? What if we made it public? Spread copies across every settlement, every trading post, every place where people gather? Calloway would just claim they're forgeries. Maybe, but 12 families' worth of testimony. 37 dead whose stories get told. That's not something he can just dismiss. Jacob warmed to the idea. It becomes pressure. Federal pressure. The kind that forces Marshal Wardell to act immediately instead of waiting for his scheduled visit. Henry stared at Jacob for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting and what looked like signed statements. This is everything, Henry said quietly. 5 years of work. Names, dates, witnesses. Some of the witnesses are already dead, but their statements remain. He held it out to Jacob. You think you can get this published? Not published. Copied and distributed. There's a printing press in Helena, 40 miles west. If we can reach it, we can't, Margaret said flatly. Look at us. Papa can barely stand. Sarah's wounded. You're down to 4 bullets, and Calloway's men are outside waiting. Then we make them not wait. Jacob took the journal, tucking it inside his coat. We give them a target they can't resist. Me. That's suicide, Sarah said. It's a distraction. Jacob checked the cave entrance. I walk out, hands up, pretend to surrender. While Calloway's focused on me, you 3 slip out and head west. The evidence goes with you. They'll torture you, Margaret said quietly. Make you tell them where we went. Can't tell what I don't know. You don't tell me which route you're taking. Jacob met each of their eyes in turn. This is the play. It's not a good play, but it's what we've got. The sound of footsteps on stone echoed through the ravine. Calloway's men were closing in, checking every crevice, every shadow. They had maybe minutes before the cave was discovered. There has to be another way, Margaret insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. They all knew the truth. They were out of time and options. Henry grabbed Jacob's arm one final time. The journal. Guard it with your life. I'll guard it with 3 lives. Jacob pressed the journal into Margaret's hands instead. Yours, Sarah's, and your father's. Mine doesn't matter nearly as much. Before any of them could protest, Jacob stepped toward the cave entrance, raised his hands and shouted, Calloway! Let's talk! Jacob stepped out of the cave with his hands raised, rifle left behind, wearing nothing but his determination and the certainty that he was about to die. The morning sun hit his face, warm despite the October chill, and for a moment he wondered if this was what his father had felt, that strange calm before violence. Calloway's men materialized from the rocks like wolves, 6 of them, rifles trained on Jacob's chest. Behind them, Harrison Calloway descended into the ravine with the careful steps of a man who never doubted his victory. Wise choice, Mr. Bennett. Calloway's smile was the smile of a snake that had just cornered a mouse. Where are the others? Gone. Took a route you'll never find. Jacob kept his voice steady. Which is why we're going to make a deal. I don't make deals with dead men. Then you'll never get your evidence back. Jacob let that sink in. Henry Blackfeather has been gathering testimony for 5 years. Names, dates, witnesses. Everything needed to hang you 12 times over. You think he'd leave that in some cave where your men might stumble on it? Calloway's expression flickered just for a second, but Jacob saw it. Fear. The one thing the powerful man hadn't accounted for was that his victims might be smart enough to hide the weapon that could destroy him. You're bluffing. Am I? Then kill me and spend the rest of your life wondering when those papers will surface. When Marshal Wardell will knock on your door with federal charges. Jacob took a step forward, despite the rifles pointed at him. Or you could let me walk out of here, and I'll make sure those papers disappear. Nobody sees them. Nobody knows. Your empire stays intact. In exchange for what? The black feathers go free. They leave the territory, you never pursue them, and the water rights stay with the tribe. Jacob held Calloway's gaze. Small price for keeping your neck out of a noose. Calloway studied him for a long moment. Then he laughed, genuine amusement that echoed off the ravine walls. You're a terrible liar, Mr. Bennett. I can see it in your eyes. Calloway gestured to his men. The evidence isn't going anywhere. Henry Blackfeather is dying, his daughters are wounded and exhausted, and you're about to tell me exactly where they're hiding. The only question is how much pain you endure first. Two men grabbed Jacob's arms, forcing him to his knees. A third stepped forward with rope, binding his wrists behind his back with practiced efficiency. Jacob didn't resist. Resistance now would waste energy he'd need later. Last chance, Calloway said, pulling a knife from his belt. Where are they? West, headed for Helena. Jacob kept his voice flat, emotionless. Every second he bought was another second for Margaret, Sarah, and Henry to put distance between themselves and this ravine. Helena is 40 miles through rough terrain. They'll never make it. Calloway crouched in front of Jacob, the knife catching sunlight. But you're going to tell me their exact route anyway. We'll start with fingers. Most men talk after losing two. The knife moved toward Jacob's hand, and he braced himself for pain that would define the next hour of his life. But before steel touched skin, a gunshot cracked through the ravine. One of Calloway's men dropped, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Everyone froze. Another shot, and a second man fell. The remaining four scattered, seeking cover, shouting in confusion. Calloway dove behind a boulder, his confidence evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. Margaret emerged from the rocks above, Henry's rifle in her hands, working the bolt with mechanical precision. Sarah appeared on the opposite side, pistol firing in steady rhythm. They'd circled back. They'd positioned themselves on high ground, while Jacob played bait. Jacob didn't waste the opportunity. He rolled toward the nearest dropped rifle, hands still bound, using his shoulder to knock it toward himself. A bullet sparked off stone inches from his head, but he kept moving, kept fighting. Get him! Calloway screamed. Don't let him! Jacob's bound hands found the rifle trigger. He rolled onto his back and fired blindly upward. The shot went wild, but it was enough to make Calloway's men hesitate. Enough to shift their focus from offense to defense. Margaret's next shot took out the man who'd been reaching for Jacob. Sarah's pistol clicked empty, but she'd already grabbed a fallen rifle, continuing the barrage. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had surprise and desperation on their side. Jacob struggled to his feet, rifle clutched awkwardly in bound hands. He stumbled toward where Margaret was positioned, using covering fire to reach her. "You were supposed to run," he gasped when he reached her position. "We did run." Margaret was already cutting his bonds with her knife. "Ran in a circle right back to you. Papa's idea. Where is he?" "Safe. Hidden where they won't find him." Margaret freed Jacob's hands. "Now we finish this." Below, Calloway was rallying his remaining men, 3 of them now, all taking defensive positions. The tide had turned, but the fight wasn't over. Calloway still had resources, still had the backing of territorial power. "We can't win a prolonged fight," Jacob said, checking his ammunition. 2 rounds. "They'll bring reinforcements." "Then we don't fight prolonged." Margaret pointed to where the ravine narrowed into a bottleneck. "We trap them, force them into a position where numbers don't matter." It was risky. It was probably insane, but it was also exactly the kind of unexpected move that might work. They moved quickly, Sarah providing covering fire while Jacob and Margaret positioned themselves at the bottleneck. If Calloway's men wanted out of the ravine, they'd have to come through a space barely wide enough for one person at a time. "Calloway," Jacob shouted. "New deal. You surrender now. I'll make sure Marshal Wardle knows you cooperated. Might save you from hanging." The response was a volley of gunfire that sent all three of them diving for cover. Apparently negotiation time was over. "They're going to try to rush us," Margaret said, reloading her rifle. "All at once, hoping to overwhelm our position. Let them try." Jacob checked the bottleneck approach. "They come through there 3 at a time, maximum. We can hold." Sarah moved beside them, her wounded arm bound tight but still functional. "How long do we need to hold?" "Until they realize this is costing more than it's worth." Jacob met her eyes. "Or until we run out of ammunition. Whichever comes first." The attack came faster than expected. Calloway's men charged the bottleneck in a desperate rush, firing as they ran. Jacob took the first man down with his second-to-last bullet. Margaret got the second. Sarah's pistol clicked empty, but the third man hesitated, seeing his companions fall. That hesitation cost him. Margaret's follow-up shot caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling, and then suddenly it was quiet. 3 men down. The ravine filled with gun smoke and the smell of blood. Jacob scanned for Calloway, but saw no sign of the man. "He ran," Margaret said, disbelief in her voice. Calloway ran. "Smart move." Jacob stood slowly, every muscle aching. "He's not a fighter. He's a businessman. When the cost exceeds the profit, you cut your losses." But Jacob's instincts screamed warning. Men like Calloway didn't just run. They regrouped. They came back with overwhelming force. This wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. "We need to move," Jacob said. "Get your father, gather whatever supplies we can carry, and put as many miles as possible between us and here before Calloway returns with an army." They found Henry where Sarah had hidden him, wedged into a crevice so narrow Calloway's men would have walked past it a dozen times without seeing. The old man was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. "Is it done?" Henry whispered. "For now." Jacob helped Margaret pull her father from the hiding spot. "But Calloway will be back, and he'll be angry." "The journal," Henry clutched at Jacob's coat. "You still have it?" Margaret patted her own jacket. "Safe with me, Papa. Nobody's taking it." They gathered the weapons and ammunition from the fallen men, a grim necessity that left Jacob feeling like a scavenger. 3 rifles, 4 pistols, maybe 60 rounds total, enough to fight one more battle, maybe 2 if they were careful. The paint mare had wandered back during the fighting, drawn by familiar voices. She was exhausted, her shoulder wound still seeping. But she was alive and willing to carry Henry's weight one more time. They rode west, not toward Helena, as Jacob had told Calloway, but south toward the territorial border, a calculated misdirection that might buy them an extra day before Calloway figured out the deception. The sun climbed toward noon, and with it came the heat that made Jacob's wounds throb with each heartbeat. He'd been hit during the fighting, he wasn't sure when exactly. A bullet that had grazed his side, leaving a burning line across his ribs. Not serious, but serious enough to remind him that luck didn't last forever. They stopped at a stream to water the horses and clean wounds. Margaret worked on Jacob's side with cloth torn from her dress, her hands steady despite the trembling in her jaw. "You came back," Jacob said quietly. "I told you to run, and you told Calloway we'd gone to Helena when we were 50 feet away." Margaret didn't look up from her work. "Seems like nobody in this group follows instructions. I was trying to save your lives. We know. That's why we came back to save yours." Margaret finally met his eyes, and Jacob saw something there that made his chest tighten. "You stood between us and Calloway twice now. Stood when you could have walked away with money in your pocket. That means something? Means I'm too stubborn to know when to quit. Means you're the man my father bet on." Margaret tied off the bandage. $20 for a horse, and a prayer that honor still existed in this territory. Looks like his prayer got answered. Sarah was tending to Henry, who'd slipped back into unconscious sleep. The old man's color was bad, gray beneath his weathered tan, his breathing too shallow. They were running out of time. He's not going to make it 3 weeks, Sarah said, voicing what they all knew. Maybe not 3 days at this rate. Then we don't wait 3 weeks. Jacob pulled out his map, studying the routes south. There's a settlement called Copper Ridge, 2 days' ride if we push hard. They have a doctor, and more importantly, they have a telegraph office. A telegraph to where? Margaret asked. Federal Marshal's office in the territorial capital. We send word directly to Wardell. Tell him there's evidence of federal crimes and that Harrison Calloway is actively hunting witnesses. Jacob traced the route. If Wardell is half as incorruptible as your father believes, he'll come immediately. And if he doesn't, then we've wasted 2 days and some telegraph fees. Jacob folded the map. But it's better than sitting in a cave waiting for your father to die or for Calloway to find us. They rode hard through the afternoon, climbing into higher elevations where the air turned cold and thin. Jacob kept watching their back trail, searching for signs of pursuit. Nothing yet, but he could feel it, that pressure of being hunted, that certainty that Calloway wouldn't stop until one side or the other was dead. As the sun began setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, they found a sheltered spot among the pines. No fire, smoke could be seen for miles. Just cold camp and colder prospects. Henry woke briefly as night fell, his eyes fever-bright. Jacob, he whispered, his hand finding Jacob's sleeve. If I don't make it, you'll make it. If I don't, Henry insisted, the journal goes to Marshal Wardell directly. No intermediaries, no deputies. Only Wardell. Anyone else might be in Calloway's pocket. I understand. And my daughters. Henry's grip tightened. They're strong, but they'll need someone. Someone who won't let the territory eat them alive. Someone who... I'll watch over them, Jacob promised. As long as they'll let me. Henry smiled slightly. You're a good man, Jacob Bennett. Better than the $20 I had to offer. Better than I had any right to hope for. That $20 bought the most expensive horse in Montana, Jacob said quietly. And the best deal I ever made. Henry's eyes closed, his breathing evening out into sleep again. Jacob sat watch, while Margaret and Sarah huddled together for warmth, their exhaustion finally overcoming their fear. The stars emerged, cold and distant. Jacob thought about the last week, how a simple horse purchase had unraveled into violence and blood and moral choices he'd never expected to face. How $20 had bought him responsibility for 3 lives and war against a man who owned half the territory. His father would have laughed at the irony, would have said something about how the Bennett men could never take the easy path, could never just mind their own business and let injustice pass unchallenged. Maybe it was genetic, maybe it was learned. Either way, Jacob was committed now. Committed to seeing this through, whatever that cost. Dawn came cold and unforgiving. Henry's fever had spiked during the night. His forehead burned to the touch, his breathing ragged. They had to move faster, had to reach Copper Ridge before the infection from his head wound turned fatal. They rode hard through the morning, the landscape growing more rugged with each mile. Around midday, Sarah suddenly reined in her horse, her face pale. Smoke, she said, pointing south. Coming from where Copper Ridge should be. Jacob's stomach dropped. Black smoke rose in thick columns against the blue sky. Too much smoke for cooking fires. Too concentrated for anything except destruction. They approached cautiously, but Jacob already knew what they'd find. Copper Ridge was burning. The settlement's dozen buildings were engulfed in flames, and bodies lay in the street where they'd fallen trying to escape. Calloway, Margaret breathed, her voice hollow with horror. He did this, as a message. Jacob dismounted, searching for survivors. He's telling the territory what happens to anyone who might help us. They found one survivor, the town doctor, badly burned, but alive. He died in Margaret's arms minutes later, but not before gasping out the truth. Men came this morning, said anyone who helped the Blackfeathers would burn. Then they torched everything. Blood bubbled from his lips. Telegraph office first. They were making sure you couldn't call for help. He died with his eyes open, staring at a sky he'd never see again. Jacob stood in the ashes of Copper Ridge, surrounded by bodies of people whose only crime was living in a town that might have offered help to fugitives. The scale of Calloway's evil was staggering. He'd murdered an entire settlement just to eliminate one possible refuge. "We can't keep running," Margaret said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "Every place we go, every person who helps us, Calloway will destroy them. We're carrying death with us." "Then we stop running." Jacob checked his rifle, checked his ammunition, checked the fire burning in his chest that said enough was enough. "We take the fight to Calloway directly." "That's insane," Sarah protested. "We're 4 people. He has an army. He has hired thugs. There's a difference." Jacob mounted his horse. "And we have something he doesn't. We have nothing left to lose. That makes us more dangerous than any army." Henry, barely conscious, managed to speak. "The mill. His timber mill. Everything he's built depends on that mill processing logs. If it burns, we destroy his fortune and his power in one night." Jacob felt the plan crystallizing. "And we make enough noise doing it that every federal marshal in 3 territories will come investigate." It was desperate. It was probably suicide. But as Jacob looked at the burning remains of Copper Ridge, at the innocent people murdered for the crime of existing in the wrong place, he knew there was no other choice. They would strike at the heart of Calloway's empire. They would make him pay in blood and money and terror. And if they died doing it, at least their deaths would mean something. "One attack," Jacob said, looking at Margaret and Sarah. "One massive, undeniable act that forces federal attention. We burn Calloway's mill, we scatter his evidence to every newspaper in the territory, and we make so much noise that Wardell has to come immediately." "And after?" Margaret asked. "After we pray we survive long enough to see Calloway hang." They rode toward the timber mill as the sun set on the worst day of their lives. Behind them, Copper Ridge burned. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, Harrison Calloway waited with his empire and his evil. The war Jacob had bought for $20 was about to reach its final, bloody conclusion, and nobody, not Calloway, not his hired killers, not the corrupt officials who protected him, was ready for what 4 desperate people could do when they stopped running and started fighting back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.